for a moment about the history of mathematics. The rules of arithmetic were created, invented, discovered many centuries ago in ancient civilizations in Persia, in Greece, in Egypt, and later in the great Islamic empires. Europe was something of a latecomer, actually, to mathematics. Many Europeans, of course, benefit from these profound discoveries in mathematics. Imagine if Europe had to pay licensing fees to these earlier societies. How would that have affected Europe's development? Think of the rules of addition or the rules of division. These are things that you learnt as a child, multiplication tables. They're driven by algorithms. The rules of arithmetic, lying behind them, are algorithms. So think of an algorithm of addition. For example, x plus 0 equals x. Every day we use that rule. We do mental calculations in our head. Every day, trillions of calculations are performed by computers using the algorithm of addition. An intellectual property owner could lay claim to an algorithm. So the social consequences of creating a private property right in something as important as the algorithms for addition are very profound.
Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Lynn Fries in Geneva. That was a clip from a talk on understanding intellectual property by Peter Drahos. How intellectual property rights got linked to trade is the story of TRIPS. Current trade deals like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TTIP, CETA are TRIPS Plus. So what's TRIPS? The most important intellectual property agreement of the 20th century, TRIPS was a trade agreement. TRIPS stands for Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, a World Trade Organization agreement. Two keywords being trade-related, which in one fell swoop integrated intellectual property into the world system of trade and so globalized intellectual property rights. On the 1st of January 1995, TRIPS literally came into force as it criminalized any infringement of its IP standards, standards that define knowledge as private property, needing criminal protection from theft, much like a car. TRIPS Plus trade deals push harder and further for more and more. Peter Drahos says the role of free trade agreements is to expand intellectual property's empire. Joining us from Australia to explain the story of IP linked to trade is Peter Drahos. Peter Drahos is a professor at the Australian National University, the School of Regulation and Global Governance. He holds a chair in intellectual property, Queen Mary, the University of London. Peter Drahos is co-author with John Braithwaite of Information Feudalism, Who Owns the Knowledge Economy, and the award-winning Global Business Regulation. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Lynn. I'm very glad to be here.
Let's start with some big-picture context on TRIPS.
Yes, intellectual property, or TRIPS, was part of a much broader agenda, and this agenda had really been laid out by the OECD back in the 1960s and early 1970s, in which a lot of these ideas for transforming the world economy were thought about and written about. The idea was really to free the world in terms of capital investment. So the idea was that capital could move wherever it liked and obtain the most favourable circumstances that it could. Now, the problem with that is that a lot of regulation has to be removed along the way in order for that to happen. Because obviously not all countries are equally wealthy. Some countries, for example, regulate the prices of patents. That was something that the pharmaceutical industry was very much opposed to. They really wanted unregulated patent prices. And of course, the effect of that is to raise the price of medicines. So if you are really committed to the idea of capital moving freely throughout the world without any restrictions, the implication for national sovereignty is pretty profound. TRIPS is probably the most significant agreement of the 20th century. There were a lot of them, but TRIPS really created a global platform for multinationals. Every country that joins the WTO, the World Trade Organization, has to comply with TRIPS. And the TRIPS case study, I think, it's a very important study in how a trade negotiation fails citizens, because it was conducted in secrecy. Consumers weren't present, but even more importantly, it was drafted by the corporations themselves, because corporations have a lot of technical expertise. They have patent attorneys, they have intellectual property lawyers that are advising them. And so they were actually able to draft clauses. In fact, there was an entire draft agreement that was tabled by the Intellectual Property Committee before negotiators in the late 1980s. And essentially, multinationals from Japan, from Europe, and from the United States said to world governments, this is what we want. So it's not just a case of simple lobbying, it's a very sophisticated form of global networking in which actual text is produced to influence what is ultimately, or what are ultimately, public laws. So the idea that private power drafts laws that we all have to abide by is something that should worry people in democracies.
You've written extensively that a corporate elite has played the knowledge game for over a century, but wanted to change the rules of the game several decades back, and that the appointment of Edmund Pratt to Pfizer as CEO in the 1970s was a key event in making it happen. Talk about that.
Well, I think the Pfizer story is a really interesting story about how one can change the world, how individuals can change the world. So we often talk about globalization as this abstract thing, but what we don't realise is that individuals have important ideas. Now, in the case of Pfizer and Edmund Pratt, as well as the consultants that he hired or that gave him advice, their big idea was to stick intellectual property into trade agreements. It's a simple but very, very powerful idea. So the whole significance of this story, in a way, lies in the fact that individuals change the rules of the game. Globalization is not just an abstract force. People make our world, and they make it in response to certain values or goals that they have.
Talk about the key players and their agenda.
The key players were the pharmaceutical industry, because they were amongst the first companies to internationalise. They saw the possibility of markets in poorer countries like India and China. But aside from pharmaceutical companies, there were also telecommunications companies, or what we now broadly understand to be information technology companies, because they could see the importance of global markets. Agricultural companies that specialised in farm-related activities like Monsanto, but as well automotive or manufacturing companies such as General Electric, companies that essentially took out a lot of patents. And of course, then there were the cultural industries. So the movie industry, for example, where obviously the United States had a lot of important interests because of its very strong motion picture industry. So there were a range of industries that came to understand that they would do better if they could strengthen their monopolies. It's not that they didn't already have intellectual property rights, they did. But what they wanted was to strengthen them far more. They essentially wanted to turn knowledge, which is a public good, into a private good. It's a kind of simple but powerful idea. And a way to think about it is to say, look, knowledge is inherently a public good. I mean, knowledge basically just diffuses throughout the world. It has for most of human history. The reason we have the equality in the world that we do is because knowledge has moved around. People have learned how to do things from other people. So TRIPS was really about eliminating competitors. So, for example, the Indian generic industry was able to manufacture high quality products that people all around the world benefited from. So the idea that the US pharmaceutical industry had was that it could use TRIPS to impose product patents on Indian pharmaceutical manufacturers. The motion picture industry saw a way of strengthening copyright. And very importantly, the big advantage of sticking intellectual property rights into a trade agreement was that the GATT, or the WTO as we now know it, had an enforcement mechanism, so that you basically had a means of enforcing these rights if countries did not comply with the standards. And that was the real power behind the idea, that you basically could retaliate against countries using your trade defence tools, whatever they happen to be.
So U.S. corporate leaders were the key players.
It wasn't just the United States that was ultimately involved in TRIPS, because to impose a set of intellectual property rights on the entire world, when most countries are going to be losers from intellectual property rights, I mean, not many poor people are going to gain from high-priced textbooks in places like Pakistan or Vietnam or some of the really poor countries in the world. You're really raising the cost of education for these countries. You're raising the cost of medicines. You're raising inputs into farming. I mean, why on earth would countries take on a deal like that? So these corporate leaders in the United States needed the benefit or the help, the assistance of their European counterparts. So it wasn't just US pharmaceutical companies that got in on the game, and it wasn't just US agricultural companies and US IT companies. And the same is true for Japan. I mean, Japan also had pretty strong interests. We forget that Japan was the second biggest economy in the world by this stage. And so it's really these three countries that come together and have interests. So it wasn't that the United States had it all its own way. It had to compromise. It had to recognise European interests. But we can essentially talk about this as a sort of Anglo-American hegemony in which Japan assisted. And they essentially then inflicted this agreement on the rest of the world, who were profound losers.
We're going to break and be back with part 2. Please join us as we continue this series on IP linked to trade with Peter Drahos. Peter Drahos, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.